Hi, and welcome to part 4 of making scientific figures with Adobe Illustrator. So in this part, we'll be talking about the effects panel and how to make all those really cool things that you've seen in many scientific journals. So I want to start out with a really simple example in order to get people to understand how Illustrator creates and treats effects. So let's go to the pen tool and let's just make a 1D line. And so what the effects panel does is it'll either do either do some sort of mathematical transformation on your object. So as a simple example, let's go to distort and transform. So zigzag. So what this does is on a 1D line. So this is one good way to make a sawtooth pattern. And so here, this controls the number of segments in that wavy line. This controls the amplitude. And we can make the curve smooth. So this is one really quick way to make a sine wave pattern in Illustrator. Now notice, this is the one thing to learn about how Illustrator treats effects. Notice that when I highlight the feature, it's still this 1D path. And what Illustrator is doing is putting on top of that path, it's transforming that path into this curvy line. And so if I go to my direct select tool A, and I click and drag my feature, it's always this 1D line, but it's just applying that transformation on top of that. So if I want to make this feature real, if I want to make it editable, I want to not make it a 1D line anymore. I want it to actually fill out this curve. You would highlight the feature and go to Object and Expand Appearance. And notice now it's this. Now the object is no longer that 1D line. Now it's this filled out curve, and now you can start to change the microscopic, the small local properties of this curve that way. So let's go back to when it's just a 1D effect. So now I've reversed everything using Shift C to undo. I've gone back to when it's a 1D path with this effect on top of it. So if I go to my appearance panel here, appearance, or you can go to window and appearance there. So I mentioned this in the previous section. Here we're seeing the hierarchy of all the appearances that are happening to this object. So we can see zigzag is here. So if we ever want to turn that feature off, we just click on the eyeball and it goes back to being a 1D path that way. And if you ever want to get rid of a feature, or let's first edit it. Suppose we want to add more segments to this. You don't have to go back into window and do all of that. Actually, it'll warn you that that's not the right way to do it. If you want to edit this feature, you click again on zigzag, and now we can continue to, if I scroll up, change the number of segments and do this in a very live way. So this is one good way to keep it as an appearance, as opposed to filling it out if you aren't finished with the artwork and you still might do edits to it in the future. So another useful way to use the transform panel, transform section of effect is, let's show an example. Let's make a circle, and let's make this a with no fill. Now suppose that I wanted to make duplicates of this circle. We can go to effect. I mean, we could of course just use duplicate using alt, doing this way, but I'll show you there's one really neat way to do this using the transform in effect. So we go to effect, distort and transform, we can do things like move it in space. Right? Now the nice thing is that, notice this section down here with copies. If we increase the number of copies, it'll continue to apply that transformation. Now another thing we can do is we can actually change the scale each time it makes that duplicate. So we can actually shrink it. Maybe that's too much. Let's do 70%. Notice that each time I duplicate, we're making a smaller and smaller circle. Now we can also apply that transformation to the scale of the stroke. So notice that it's keeping the stroke the same while it's making those duplicates, but we can also have its scale change in the size of the circle. So as the circle is getting smaller, the stroke is also starting to get thinner. And notice that you can control here what this panel is telling you is where are we applying that duplication. We can apply it vertically, to the side, downward, or from the center. And again, this is happening only, right? This is the object that is actually clickable is only the circle. And this effect, if I go to appearance panel, is here under transform. So I can turn it on and off. What that means is that no matter what shape this is, it'll apply the transformation. So notice you can start to do really cool things this way. Now another really useful way to use that transform panel, which is actually, this is most of the time that I've used it, it's come up with this very specific problem of making something that's radially symmetric around a circle. So suppose I have a feature that I want to go around this circle. So suppose it's a vertical line. Let me draw a vertical line like this. And let's just give it a different color. Suppose I want to make duplicates of this line all around the circle and have it radially symmetric. You could try to copy it and rotate it and do things like this, but there's a much nice and faster way to do this using that transform section of the effect. So what we want to do is make an empty point right at the center of our circle. So I'm just going to click once with the pen tool, and I'm not going to click anywhere else. I'm going to click escape. So notice that I have an anchor point there now. So I'm going to hold down, I'm going to select both that anchor point and my object together, and I'm going to group them. So Shift G. So I have this thing. Oh, maybe I didn't click it. Let's do that again. Let's hold down this. Shift. Command G. There we go. Now they're grouped. Okay, now we can see that when I highlight it, both the empty anchor point and that line is highlighted. So let's highlight this whole thing, and you'll see that what I did making that empty point is this is going to be my pivot point around which I'm going to make duplicates by revolving that feature several times. So let's go to Effect, Distort and Transform, Transform, and I want to rotate. I can rotate by some finite amount. Now notice that I want to apply this at the very bottom. So now this is applying to this bottom pivot point here. I'm going to put, let's do several copies. Notice that I increase the copies, it's making that feature symmetric around this bottom pivot point. So the key thing is to choose this part here. So we're making, so that we're applying this transformation at the bottom of that bounding box. And the cool thing is that we can apply, remember we can do math, so if we want to do, if we want to do 17 of these, we do it by this angle. Let's redo. If I want to edit that transform, I just click on transform there. We can change this to any number of divisions. We can do this by 40, hit tab instead. And then just you can scroll up and make the number of copies this way. So this is one really quick way to do radially symmetric things like this. And so if you want to do, change this thing in any way, just remember that you need you need to define where your anchor point is going to be, where your pivot position is going to be. So this is one really useful tool that just really increases your workflow. Okay, so those are 1D features. Now let's look at some of the capability of Illustrator of making 3D shapes or quasi 3D shapes. So let's make a square. Actually, I'll give this a strange shape just so people can see that. It can be any shape that you want. So I'm going to make this strange shape here. Now, if we want to make 3D effects, we go to Effect, 3D, and there's 3 features here. I'll go through the first one, Extrude and Bevel. What this does is it takes that 2D shape, it extrudes it out of the plane of the laptop screen, and it'll extrude it by this depth, 50 points. So notice that if I scroll up, it's making the feature deeper. Here's a cartoon that's telling you what is the orientation of that feature that you've extruded. So you can actually choose which angle, what is the 3-dimensional angle that you want to see your object at. Now, another important thing down here is the perspective. So when you don't click perspective, you have an orthographic view of the image. But if you increase perspective, let's choose this direction here. And I'll just move the light to make it a little bit more dramatic. Let's put it up here. Yeah. So notice that when I go down to no perspective versus very high perspective, what that means is that there's a horizon line now. So parallel lines will meet at the horizon line. Whereas in when you have 0 perspective, parallel lines will never meet. So that's the orthographic view. So other options that are here, so normally this is what the panel usually looks like with just these options. So if you want to go to look at different ways like controlling the direction of the light or the quality of the light, click on more options. And now here you can actually play with what is the ambient level of light. You can change the highlight intensity, so how bright that light is. So you can look at this preview here, the size of the highlight. And I'll mention I'll mention next what blend steps are. That's really important for especially revolved features. Okay, so that's extrude and bevel. Oh, let me go back and show you what bevel means. So I've never actually used this, but this might come up. So bevel just means how is it going to bevel that shape. So here you can make edges. So every edge of your feature gets shaven that way, and here you can control the height of that bevel. I think I've only used this maybe once, but this is something good to know. So there's all sorts of different shapes that you can apply, different beveling shapes to your feature. Let's take this off. So this is extruding a 2D shape. And notice again that this extrude is just an appearance on that original 2D shape. So the thing that you can only click on is that 2D shape. What that means is I can change it in some sort of way, and it'll do this extrude and bevel on this 2D shape that I'm currently playing with. So it's editable, it's live. Okay, so that's extrude and bevel. Most of the time we want to make a sphere. So let's see what revolve does. So if I make let's make another object like this. So what revolve does and says is it will rotate that 2D shape that you've done and rotate it in 3-dimensional space. Or rotate it by a full, I think the default is this full 360. A cool thing to do is you can actually make this not full 360, so you can make this a wedge. So if I rotate my feature this way, you can instead make cuts like this. So this tells you how much do you want to rotate that feature. And the default is 360. So this is a full rotation. You control the angle just like before, rotating this way. And what's important, especially for revolving, is where are you rotating from? Depending on what your 2D shape is, rotating from the left side or the right side will be very different. So if I click right side instead, we can see it's making the cylinder on the right. the offset is the distance from that edge. So if I start to increase this, we're making now, instead of that cylinder, we now have a washer shape. And so here's when blend steps is actually really important. Notice that what the blend steps are is the number of um, um, basically pixels that it's, the number of radians, the divisions in this rotation. So it's dividing this 360 degrees into 25 steps. So in order to make that much smoother, you can just increase the number of blend steps. And so you can just scroll until it's much, much harder to see the divisions there. You can artificially lower this to something really low, and you can see the effect. So it's always good to, especially when you're doing things with smooth surfaces like cylinders or spheres, that you want to have the blend steps fairly high so that you don't see them right away. So if we wanted to make instead a sphere, we'd have to revolve a semicircle. So let's make a circle first. So that's a filled circle. So if I try to just rotate this, there is no option to rotate it around its center. So if I did revolve, we get this donut shape. And in fact, if we wanted to make a torus, this is one good way to do it. You can change the offset. Let's do the right edge. There we go. This is one way to do a torus. So if instead we wanted to do a circle, what we'd have to do is turn this into a semicircle. So one quick way is to go into Direct Select Tool, highlight this anchor point, the one on the left, and just delete it. So now we have a semicircle. So now if I go back into Effect and revolve, and there goes my sphere. And again, notice you can see all these small gradations, and that's because the blend steps are really low. If I change this to 100, you can see that's much, much better. Now again, remember that this is still a 2D shape, and that Blender is making a mathematical calculation in order to give you this preview of this 3D shape. But just like before, if we want, we can go back and actually expand this feature. So I'll just show you what happens when you do that. If we go to Object, Expand Appearance, notice that these are all the vectors. We have so many vectors here because I increased the number of blends. So each one of these washers is basically a different color in order to give a much, much better view to the eye. And so I just wanted to show you what is actually happening when you expand this feature. So now it's no longer editable. It's a fully vectorized thing, so I can't just play with it anymore. But this is one good thing to know. Okay. So the other way to play in the third dimension, let's make another object. Actually, let's make a rectangle there. It's much clearer to see what's actually happening. So the other way that you can play in 3 dimensions is to rotate a 2-dimensional shape in 3-dimensional space. So that's what rotate does. So rotate is now taking that 2D image and rotating in 3D space. So this is kind of like looking at a postcard and rotating it so that it's flat. So notice that if I rotate it close to here, there's almost no dimension at all. And why is that useful? Well, there's sometimes, if you've ever seen papers where you're presenting 3-dimensional data with 2D images stacked on top of each other. I'll show you one quick way to do that. So let me take a screen screen cap of that feature there. Suppose that's my image. If I paste, there's my screen capped image. So you can do this with images, so not just shapes, but you can rotate images the same way. And so since rotate was the last transformation that I applied, if I just apply rotate, it'll just do it again. And now my image here is rotated the same way, rotated with the same orientation as this 2D shape over here. And so this is really, really nice sometimes to stack, if you have three-dimensional data, but you want to show just two-dimensional slices of that data, this is one really nice way to stack them on top of each other. And so at this point, it's good to show some other features, some other things that are inside of the effect panel. So highlighting my image here, I can go to Effect, Stylize, and Drop Shadow. And so here it's just creating a shaded feature underneath underneath any object. I chose here the 2D rotated one just to highlight. It's hard to see the edges there. And so here, what you can control the position of that shadow. Its offset, the blur, so how much it blurs this feature. And so the next thing I want to show related to this that you might use a lot is the blur effect. So highlighting that circle, if I go to instead blur, Gaussian blur, and let's actually increase this to a good amount. There we go. So again, this is just an effect on top of an object. So if I go to my appearance panel, let's make this bigger. Here's the Gaussian blur. I can turn it on and off by clicking and unclicking the eyeball. And at this point, it's actually really good to see, if I zoom in on this feature, it appears very, very smooth. So this is actually really important, especially when submitting your figures. The property that dictates how smooth your pixels are up here in Effect, Document, and Raster effect settings. So if I make this really low, notice that when I zoom in, you can actually start to see the pixels that are defining your blur here and in your shadow and everything else. So this is a key thing, and I'll talk about it later in the next part when we talk about workflow and journal templates, is that you want to make sure that you're working at a very high pixel ratio. So when you go to Effect, Document, and Raster settings, and actually journals will suggest what is the resolution of the images that you submit. Some of them have at least 300. You can always put in other. So, 600 or higher is usually good. Some even suggest 1200. So notice that here those pixels went away. It's hard to see them. You have to zoom in by a lot in order to see those pixels now. It's harder to see them now. Okay, so one last thing I want to show, and it's about workflow. So, one point of all of these tutorials is for you to learn techniques to not only make nice figures, but make them in an efficient manner. Make them quick, so you don't have to always, do things in a very slow way. So suppose that you like to rotate your image and apply a drop shadow, and this is something that you reliably do on, several of your figures, and you'd like to save it. So if you go down to, next to Appearance, you have the Graphic Styles panel. You can also go to Window and Graphic Styles there. You can click on this feature and drag it to this panel. And now you have a preview of what it'll do. So if I make any new object, so let's make a new object here, select it, and now click that graphic style. Where did it go? It is now. here. Oh, it's because it was an object. That's why. So even I learn things. So let's do a new screen print. Let's do one here. And let's paste it. So this is our new object. We click there, and there we go. So that's exactly what it was. So the graphic style that we've produced here is specifically for images. So this is one good way to just be able to, you know, save the things that you have, save this alongside with your swatches and your custom gradients, your custom patterns, your atomic patterns, and save them for future use. So you don't have to always, recreate things from scratch. Now, one last thing I want to show about 3D are symbols. So suppose I want to put some predefined pattern on top of a 3D object. You could, I could try to use the 3D rotate effect on this image, try to get it to the right orientation, and then just drag and put it on top of this feature. There's a much nicer way to do that, and that's by turning whatever object you want to map onto your 3D object by turning it into a symbol. So if I click this object here, and I go to symbols, you can also reach it by going to window and symbols, and let me click and drag. It says this is a new symbol, but okay. And now you see a preview of that symbol there. So let's go back to this 3D object. Let's go back to appearances, and let's edit that 3D effect that we did. 3D extrude and bevel. So under more options, so you most likely see this, you go to map art. Now it's telling us the different faces of this object, right? And you can see a preview on the left of which face you're looking at. So on the top face. And what we want to do is put that symbol that we created on that top face. And notice that it appears immediately on the object on the left. So we can scale the feature so that it fits right on our object. So what we're doing is we're mapping that pattern that we created, and we're mapping it onto a 3D object. And put OK. And I notice that when I rotate my feature, it moves alongside. So we don't have to worry about getting the angles right like that. And this also works with text. So if you wanted to have text that's on this side of the face, actually, let's just do it. Let's just hit T for text. Let's create some empty text. Let's change the size of the text. So we go to character. Let's make this large. So I could also, again, we could go to this. We can go to effect and rotate, but then you'd have to get all the angles right. It's much easier just to get your empty text and make it a symbol. So let's go here and change. Let's put that text on one of the faces. So let's go to next. And we want to choose this face here. So notice the red outline is on this face. And let's choose that new symbol that we made. Empty text. So if you want to rotate this, oops, having trouble grabbing the feature. And then let's shrink it like this. There we go. So this is one much easier way to map text onto a 3D object. So in the next section, I'll talk about workflow, how to create and use journal templates, how to import data into your Illustrator artboard, how to use artboards, and then we'll start to put everything together and show you how I create figures in Illustrator in a quick way. Okay, thanks.